The world is starting to turn on Israel. Its long-term allies have stopped selling it weapons, cut off some trade, and even supported arresting their leader for war crimes. Yet when it comes to Israel's survival, there is basically only one country that really matters: the United States. Since 1948, the US has given Israel over $310 billion in today's money, more foreign aid than any other country in history. America has gone to war with Israel, shared intelligence, and guaranteed the country's very existence in the world's most dangerous region. They've even had the most pro-Israel president in the last 40 years. But even in the most powerful nation on earth, the tide is starting to turn. Public support for the country has dropped to its lowest level in recorded history. Well over half of all Americans oppose giving aid to Israel, and even senior figures now, like Trump and Vance, are beginning to become more vocally critical.
If I was in the cabinet of the Israeli government, I might not be attacking the only powerful ally that I have anywhere left in the entire world.
So you've got this country which has historically been very dependent on aid from America and Europe, now looking at a real reality that this could be cut off. So what do? Well, it turns out Israel has seen this coming, and they've got a plan. This document here is the Nagel report. It was a top secret 130-page document reserved for the very highest levels of the Israeli state, answering exactly that question: how to survive without America. Everything that's happening now, the war with Iran, the $110 billion domestic arms push, the quiet nuclear expansion, is all part of a carefully woven plan. And now we're entering the last phase in its massive gamble for true independence. Whether the plan will work is another thing, but it's increasingly looking more inevitable that it's going to be called into action. Here's what would happen if Israel was cut off from the Western world, and here is Israel's secret plan to survive without America. For any other country to have a special plan to survive without outside support is literally just a normal economic budget. But Israel isn't just any country. To their north, they've got Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, and to their south, Gaza and Egypt, and to the east, the West Bank and Jordan. This dynamic has existed since the day the country was founded, so from the very beginning, Israel knew that the only way that they could survive was by making themselves indispensable to the most powerful nation on earth. At the time of their formation, the CIA had almost no ground presence in the Middle East, which ultimately made it almost impossible to gather reliable intelligence on Soviet-backed Arab militaries, much less actually prepare for a conflict. So in 1951, the CIA and Mossad quietly agreed to share intelligence, making Israel a crucial Cold War asset. And after the country destroyed a coalition of Soviet-backed Arab armies in just 6 days in 1967, it handed the US an entire arsenal of captured Soviet weapons, tanks, radar systems, missiles that American engineers could tear apart and study. In return, America would support Israel in basically anything that they wanted, giving them weapons, trade deals, even using their UN veto to protect this country. Even though the Cold War ended over 30 years ago, this relationship between the two countries has continued unchallenged ever since. This shows all of the money Israel was spending on its military before October 7th, about $22 billion. And of that, about 75% comes from taxes, taken from things like their booming tech sector, tourism, and of course just general household taxation. But there's also this. This bubble shows the amount of money the US gives in military aid to Israel every year, a total of around $5 billion, enough to fund the entire Iron Dome and still have a couple of billion to spare. Since the 1950s, the US has given about $300 billion in aid to Israel, more than it gave the entire continent of Africa in the very same period. And while the sheer quantity of military aid that America sends to Israel has come under fire in recent months, the reality is that this is just the most visible tip of a very deep iceberg. Sure, $5 billion is a lot of money, but Israel is a rich country in its own right, and this is only around 1% of its economy. So cutting it would be painful, but not detrimental. The deeper issue here is everything else that America does for it. America signed its first ever free trade agreement with Israel back in 1985, giving Israeli goods preferential access to the world's largest consumer market in a way that almost no other country enjoys. Then there are the loan guarantees. The US essentially co-signs Israel's government debt, making it basically risk-free for creditors and therefore allowing Israel to borrow at interest rates far below what it could get without the US's backing. But arguably most significantly of all, the US has almost entirely protected the country from diplomatic scrutiny from the rest of the world. Since 1972, the US has used its UN Security Council veto to block anti-Israel resolutions 42 times, and without that, they'd likely have just been exposed to countless arms embargoes and sanctions, which would again really hurt them economically. So it's safe to say that the country is exceptionally dependent on America. And a few decades ago, that support seemed basically unconditional, but now it's all beginning to change. This here shows the proportion of American citizens who support Israel. And as you can see, since the start of the war in Gaza and the war in Iran, it's fallen dramatically. But perhaps most worryingly for Israel isn't just this general collapse, it's the collapse in support amongst young Republicans, precisely the party that has historically been their biggest ally in Washington. And it's now not hard to imagine that within a couple of decades, an American president could come to power and decide that this relationship no longer makes sense. After all, the Cold War logic that originally justified it has been gone for over 30 years. That prospect understandably terrifies the Israeli government. If America really were to suddenly abandon Israel, they'd effectively be stranded, losing their key economic and military backer overnight. It's not impossible to imagine a scenario where Israel simultaneously faces a debt crisis at home and a very real threat of invasion from abroad, a combination that would quickly become unmanageable even for a country as advanced as Israel. So in 2024, Benjamin Netanyahu and his top team commissioned a secret review of the country's entire defense strategy, asking a single question: what would it actually take to survive without America? The answer came back as a top secret 130-page document from the very heart of the Israeli government, the Nagel committee report. Now, a few weeks later, this report was actually leaked, potentially by the Israeli government itself, revealing for the first time the details of Israel's plan to survive without America. And at its core, it could be broken down into three parts. First, to build a military supply chain where key tech is built locally, independent from other countries, allowing them to decide what, when, and where things get built. Second, turn their world-class tech sector into an economic engine, powerful enough to fund that military without aid. And finally, to use America while they still have its support to permanently reshape the geopolitics of the region in their favour. Of course, Israel knows better than anybody that all of this is a lot easier said than done. After all, this wouldn't be the first time that they've tried. In the 1980s, Israel spent over a decade developing its own advanced fighter jet, the IAI Lavi, funded in part by American military aid. They got all the way to working prototypes before the US realised that the plane would end up competing with their own exports, and just pulled the funding, killing the program overnight. The point is, in a world where the US makes up more than a third of global military spending, building your own independent defence industry is extremely difficult. So to have any chance of doing so, you need the manufacturing base, human capital, and crucially, export markets, all working in sync, just to become military self-sufficient, but to become so integrated into the supply chains of your allies that cutting you off stops being a realistic option. Now, in order to do this, Israel is banking on effectively becoming the world's next AI superpower. This is the first part of their grander plan, and luckily for them, they've got some, say, unique advantages when it comes to building this kind of economy. This is Unit 8200, arguably the most elite intelligence technology unit on Earth. However, unlike most companies or intelligence units, their hierarchy is pretty much flat. Conscripts as young as 18 are basically given total freedom to use some of the most advanced surveillance and data technology in the world to try and solve Israel's problems. What this means is that the unit is something of a breeding ground for tech startups. Palo Alto Networks, CyberArk, Wiz, all of these companies are worth billions of dollars, and they've come from this unit, which has put Israel right at the heart of the global tech infrastructure. So the first step in their plan is to copy exactly this model and create these companies, but rather than for cyber, they'd be building it for AI. Hey guys, I hope you've been enjoying the video so far. So we actually decided not to take a sponsor on this particular video. However, if you have been enjoying it and like the video and want to support our work, then please consider subscribing using the button down below, as it really helps out the channel and helps us to continue to grow. Anyway, now let's get back to the video. Now, Israel already ranks first in the world for AI adoption, using it 5 times more than the average country. And just last month, the government approved a new national AI plan, ordering thousands of Nvidia's most advanced chips and pledging $7 billion in subsidies over the next 5 years, all with one goal: turning Israel into a global AI powerhouse. Doing so would basically serve two functions. Firstly, it would provide them with the economic growth to fund their massive military budget, something which is already taking up around 8% of GDP. But perhaps more importantly, by making the rest of the world reliant on your Israeli tech, you make it a lot less likely that anyone can cut you off, as they're effectively reliant on you. Now, as you're probably aware, doing anything with AI needs a huge amount of energy. But the trouble is, Israel's total potential electricity capacity for an AI data center is around just a tenth of a single large-scale AI facility in the United States. So what that means is that for any part of their plan to work and get the rest of the world hooked on their own AI tech, they'll need to find their energy from somewhere else. And that brings us to the second part of their plan: to force Saudi Arabia, one of the largest energy producers, to move into their circle of influence. The immediate issue with this one is that historically, the two countries haven't exactly gotten along well. Saudi Arabia hasn't even recognized Israel as a state, and for decades it's been one of the primary financial backers of the Palestinian cause. At the same time, for Israel to build the kind of codependency with the rest of the world that they're hoping for, they'd almost certainly need Saudi energy. So the question then becomes, how do you turn one of your most hostile neighbours into an economic partner? Well, one option might be to engage in a war with a mutually shared hostile neighbour, significant enough to basically force Saudi Arabia to realign with America and Israel. Now, that would obviously be a massive gamble, and one which would basically be impossible to get the US on side for. That is, until this happened.
No president in history has been a greater friend of the state of Israel than I have.
Donald Trump is the greatest friend that the state of Israel has ever had in the White House.
While it's nothing new for American presidents to be pro-Israel, Trump effectively gave them a blank pass to totally reshape the Gulf region with almost unconditional support. And the first thing on Israel's list was neutralizing Iran. Now, we made a separate video about this topic and why even launching missile strikes and killing the Ayatollah doesn't just end Iran as a threat. But as part of the plan, hitting Iran basically served three functions: stopping their nuclear program, gutting the terrorist network they fund across the region, and perhaps most importantly, to push Saudi Arabia towards Israel. And at least at the time, there were some quite good reasons to think that that might actually happen. The Houthis in Yemen, which were funded by Tehran, had been attacking Saudi airports and oil infrastructure for years, and part of why Saudi Arabia kept its distance from Israel was to avoid provoking Iran any further, giving them an excuse to escalate. But if you destroy Iran as a credible threat, then that risk disappears. It massively increases the chance of Saudi Arabia drifting back into Israel's orbit. After the war had begun, Netanyahu himself claimed that they'd soon be ready to build a relationship with the Saudis. So that's effectively the second part of the plan: use Trump to launch a war in Iran, weakening their enemies, while pulling key allies like Saudi Arabia into their orbit. Of course, whether this actually works is another matter entirely. In part to counter this threat, Iran began actively bombing Saudi Arabia as soon as the war started, and that understandably made Saudi Arabia extremely angry at Israel for starting the war in the first place, which, at least for now, has significantly reduced the likelihood of these two countries forming some kind of a deal. However, even if they don't manage to strike a deal, Israel still has another option to fall back on, bringing us to the third and final part of their plan: to build an entirely self-sufficient military-industrial complex. In December 2025, Netanyahu announced 350 billion shekels, around $110 billion, to be spent over the next decade building an independent Israeli munitions industry. He described the country as becoming a 21st century super Sparta, entirely cutting out dependence on US supply chains. Now, for context, the US currently makes up around 42% of the international arms industry, more than 4 times as much as the next person on the list, which is France. And trying to wean yourself off that is exceptionally difficult, and something that would take any normal country decades to achieve, if they could even manage it at all. However, at the same time, Israel does have one massive advantage: they're pretty much always at war. Since the 1950s, they fought wars with Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, 2 Palestinian intifadas, and nearly 2 decades of conflict in Lebanon, and now Gaza and Iran. On the international market, that does provide them with a big edge. After all, if you're going to buy weapons, you want to make sure they actually work. A missile defense system which has actually intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles in a live conflict is way more trusted than one that performed well in a testing range. Because of this, Israeli defense exports have exploded since fighting in the Middle East began. Countries that are publicly claiming to sanction Israel Places like the UK, France, and Canada are all trying to get their hands on those weapons. And just like their AI plan, building these kinds of industries means that the prospects of the West fully cutting Israel off are a lot less likely. But on top of that, it means that even if they did cut them off, Israel will still be far more likely to survive. After all, they'll have their own weapons supply chain to fall back on. Of course, just like every other element of the plan, this is also a massive gamble. The country is already spending around 8 to 9% of its GDP every year on defense, and it's not hard to imagine a world where Israel is caught between funding a war machine and maintaining a functioning state, and ends up with neither. And whether any part of this actually works depends on every part of the plan landing at the exact right time. Decapitating Iran buys them some breathing room to build out the military-industrial complex, and the Saudi realignment hands them the energy needed to power the AI economy, which in theory would pay for all of that military spending. And at the end of it all, you've got an economy which is not only one of the most powerful, self-sufficient powerhouses in the region, but also one which the West would be reliant on for all sorts of key tech infrastructure. Okay, so this is all obviously an insanely ambitious plan. To go from a state almost entirely reliant on American backing to survive to one that's fully independent is no easy task. And as you might expect, there are already some holes in it starting to appear. For starters, Trump's support is clearly starting to wane. He himself confirmed his fury after Israel continued to bomb Lebanon, despite a ceasefire that Trump had personally brokered. And if his support goes before they've had a chance to fully transform the Middle East to their advantage, then the entire operation could fall apart. On top of that, the notion that the war would bring Saudi Arabia closer rather than push it away looks increasingly uncertain. As recently as May 2026, Saudi sources were saying that the kingdom would only normalize relations with Israel if an irreversible pathway to Palestinian statehood is established, directly contradicting Netanyahu's demands. In an effort to compensate for this risk, Israel has spent the past few years trying to realign with less democratic and more ideologically sympathetic partners. The big ones were Brazil under Bolsonaro, Hungary under Viktor Orban, and India under Narendra Modi. But even this support is starting to fade. Bolsonaro lost re-election in 2022 and was later sentenced to 27 years in prison. And early this year, Viktor Orban was voted out after 16 years in power, ending one of Israel's most valuable shields inside the EU. And his successor, Peter Magyar, has already said that his government would be obligated to arrest Netanyahu under the ICC warrant if he ever set foot in Hungary. The point is, having a plan is one thing, and for a country in Israel's position, they certainly need it, but actually being able to execute on it is another. Yet for a country like Israel, who is almost entirely surrounded by enemies, it could be the difference between life and death.